Self-control. We have all had those moments where it's the end of the day, we've made a bunch of decisions, and then we're posed with the decision, do I eat healthy vegetables or do I eat a pint of ice cream? And we sort of collapse. We've run out of self-control, maybe not. What do you think about the subject of self-control, our ability to make the right decision?
Well, I think it's important to understand self-control for what it is.
Okay.
It's an inhibitory pathway that's controlled by your prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
And so there's to shut down a thought or an impulse, like I want this pie,
Yeah.
or in greater scenes, I'm feeling sad today, or something like that. Any sort of impulse.
Yeah.
It requires mental processing power. It takes effort, and it takes effort from the part of the brain that most recently evolved, the prefrontal cortex, and from the part of the brain that myelinates last. And that's actually an important thing to talk about really quickly before
Myelination.
Myelination.
Myelination 101.
I'm not going to get that much into it. Basically, it just makes signals move faster along neurons. And it doesn't really finish until around the age of 25. So for younger people, they're always going to have a harder time operating this portion of their brain that shuts down impulses to do things.
So it's kind of like the roads up here in the prefrontal cortex are getting cleaned up a little more, easier to drive down them faster. Whereas in younger people, it's a little hazardous going down that road.
Exactly.
I see. Okay, so adults, for that reason, because myelination happens later, are going to have a little bit of an easier time engaging in self-control, which makes sense, because when you see a kid, like and the marshmallow test is so famous, right?
Right.
Where kids are just sitting there, told not to eat a marshmallow, really hard for them. Whereas adults, I think, maybe because we don't like marshmallows.
You're told you can get 2 marshmallows later if you don't eat the marshmallow now.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, damn, I'm on a diet. Self-control. I utilize self-control there to eat the 1 marshmallow right away.
Okay, so your thoughts on self-control are, we think it's easier for adults.
Well, it's an inhibitory complex, is the point I'm making. Is you should think of self-control with this simple pattern, which is self-control is one's ability to shut down a thought.
Okay.
And it can be hampered by all sorts of things, even in adults.
Yeah, actually, so what I find really interesting about the subject of self-control is the concept of decision fatigue, which you may or may not have heard of. It's been talked about a lot by, teachers, professionals. I think President Obama made it a very popular thing, because he said, well, I only wear blue suits or something along those lines, because that's, one fewer decision that I'm making in my day, one fewer contributory factor to decision fatigue. The concept being that if you decide every morning, what am I going to put on? What am I going to eat for breakfast? How am I going to get to work? By the time it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon, you've fatigued yourself of being able to make decisions that are responsible.
But let's talk about the research behind this, because there is research behind this on both sides, and I know you've got the counter study to it, which you love.
For a very long time, research has been very robust in saying decision fatigue is real.
Right, but sort of the way it's done is people are forced to make lots of little decisions, and then they're asked to perform some task that requires self-control, and they're typically a lot worse at it. Mm-hmm. But what's very interesting is that most of the studies that confirm the existence of decision fatigue, that after a bunch of hard decisions, we lose, our muscles get tired, essentially. Apparently a study was done in India where some believe that it's a little bit the opposite, that rather than getting fatigued by making hard decisions all day, you're just warming up. Now you're good to go. You can make all the hard decisions because you're in the groove. And they actually found that among those populations, you can perform better. And I think there were even some studies that looked at this in US-based populations as well. But they had one group read an article talking about something random, and another group read an article about how decision fatigue is not so real, or how you can improve that muscle. And those people perform better as well. So it seems like what's at play here, to a certain extent, is the placebo effect, or just sort of the power of belief, in the sense that if you believe that decision fatigue
is real, it's super real. If you believe that you can, you're just getting warmed up and you're going to make more disciplined decisions after you've made a bunch of disciplined decisions, it can actually help you. I do think there's a factor.
I think it's a factor, but I'm dubious that it doesn't exist at all. There is probably some decision fatigue.
There probably is. And you see this also with things like if your brain is compromised, you're not going to make as good decisions.
Let's talk about that because that's another area. So what are other things that can affect the prefrontal cortex and lower a person's ability to access these inhibitory pathways?
Right, so certainly things like hunger and fatigue. We all famously know that verdicts from judges right before lunch become a lot more punitive, and then after lunch they're like, oh, yeah, you're fine, and in the morning they're fine. But then so we know hunger affects things, fatigue and sleepiness affects things.
Probably the most famous is alcohol. Alcohol directly targets
judgment.
Inhibitory pathways.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just good judgment; it's inhibitory pathways. It affects your ability to be inhibitory.
Yeah. So I think those are factors, and there's no matter what you believe, there are some things that will compromise you. If you're on 3 hours of sleep for a whole week, you're not going to be thinking super well. However, I do think that what the recent research showing that maybe decision fatigue is not so universal as we think shows the power of belief and cultural beliefs. And I think it's really interesting that I think maybe decision fatigue may be stronger now than it was before because there's this pervasive belief that it's real. So to a certain extent, if a bunch of studies come out saying, coffee's going to kill you or other things, this is real, people will start believing it's real, and whether or not it's a real effect like physiologically, people will start to exhibit symptoms.
Well, I've got an alternate idea here.
Okay.
Which is the belief in decision fatigue has increased because decision fatigue and other self-control actions are actually increasing in the population. And the reason they're increasing in the population is
social media?
Not social media. It is a lack of a type of education that used to be very common, which is religious education. Religious education, every religious tradition, one of the primary ways it educates is through traditions. And almost every religious tradition has a moment in which you are supposed to exercise self-denial for a period.
I see. We have Lent, we have
Ramadan, you have, or Sundays when you don't eat fish. You're supposed to say, I am not going to act on this impulse for a period. And you grow up doing that. And like a muscle, or any other part of the brain, as people know, as you exercise parts of your brain, they get stronger. And if you grow up exercising the inhibitory aspect of your brain, that's going to be a lot stronger. And decision fatigue isn't going to be as much of a problem in your daily life. And then it may be exacerbated by stuff like
studies saying it's real. So you think perhaps a combination of perhaps some societies easing up on cultural, even like training activities that teach you to develop self-control.
Yeah.
And then also societies that are saying, yes, you are losing self-control, so you can't be responsible for that pint of ice cream that you just binged on. I think that's really interesting. Well, I think what we should take away from it from a pragmatic standpoint, like if we're going to take this information and use it for profit and gain, is that what you believe really does affect what you do.
Well, and even more than that, I'd say that if you have kids, you should have, especially if you're secular, you should have some sort of holiday in which they are taught self-denial.
Or create a culture in which it is believed within the family that when you're making hard decisions, you're warming up.
Right, and when you do this, there's been studies that show that self-denial is more effective with kids if they get to choose the thing they're denying themselves. So a good study that showed this was kids having to choose at the beginning of a play session what imaginary character they were going to play as, and then not being allowed to switch out of that imaginary character for the course of that session. Because it's self-denial, but it's self-denial they felt they had a choice
Oh, right,
over.
because in that study they found that over time those children were able to focus longer on pretend activities or something. It showed signs that they were able to focus more.
Right, that section of their brain had gotten stronger.
Because they were encouraged.
Yeah, and Lit does a great job of that, and that it gives you the chance to choose what you're going to deny yourself of.
So even if you don't necessarily participate in whatever religions that have those traditions, you might create your own. I mean, I think a lot of people do. It's January
That's what
right now.
You've been working on.
We've been coming across people who are like, for the month of January, I'm not doing carbs. So I think people do it to a certain extent.
And another thing that I was going to pick up on your sort of closing remarks there was you talking about how in our culture we often use an excuse, or there's a cultural belief that if something bad has happened to you, or you're having a hard day, then you don't need to exercise the inhibitory parts of your consciousness.
Which is a toxic way to view the world.
Which is a toxic way to view the world. And, if you have kids, I would negatively reinforce that. You don't get to eat the pint of ice cream because you're sad that day.
Yeah.
And the weirdest thing is that I've actually noticed to indulge in not exercising inhibition, people will claim to feel sadder than they are. They will claim to be having worse days than they're really having.
Oh, just to have that excuse, that out.
And through doing that, they actually feel worse throughout the day.
Of course, yeah, and you're gonna have to psych yourself up to feeling worse so that you deserve it, but then you're pulling yourself into this trench of despair.